Okay, today I'm going to talk to you about conservation. We're going to look at the different types of conservation, so in situ and ex situ conservation, and the advantages and disadvantages of each of those approaches. And we'll also look at things like botanical gardens and seed banks as examples of ex situ conservation. So why do we need conservation strategies? Well, we've got more than 31,000 species that are threatened with extinction. And we've got a large proportion of them, you can see, amphibians. We've got mammals that are threatened with extinction, conifers, birds, sharks, corals, and crustaceans. So all kinds of organisms that are threatened with extinction. So this information is from the IUCN Red List, which was established in 1964, and it's a list of comprehensive information about different species and their conservation status. So really good source of information because it will tell you why a particular species is threatened and what conservation strategies are being used in order to try and help save that particular population. So we've got different choices when it comes to conservation, and of course the choices that are going to be made are going to be based on the threats that that particular organism has. So in an ideal situation, we would use in situ conservation. That's within the natural habitat. It protects a very large population, and in fact it will protect multiple species, so not just one species going to be protected by setting up something like a national park. But it does require a large area. Generally speaking, it is less expensive than ex situ conservation strategies because less equipment is needed for the in situ conservation. If it's not possible to have in situ conservation, sometimes there's not enough land for them to set up a national park. Sometimes the risk, the threat that the population is suffering from is still there. So they'll need to move them out of that area if they want to conserve that particular species. So in that instance then, they might start to use ex situ population, and that's outside of the natural habitat. Now, this usually applies to pretty small populations in a small area, and it's a lot more expensive because there is a lot more specialist equipment and specialist staff that is involved in looking after those organisms and making sure that they're looked after correctly. So as I said, what they choose to use is going to depend on the threats that that particular organism is succumbing to. So that could be habitat loss, it could be overexploitation, it could be to do with climate change or pollution or invasive species. So they need to look at what threats those organisms have. It could be disease or something like that. And then they need to come up with a suitable solution for that particular organism. So we're going to look at a couple of different organisms, but as I said, the solutions that they pick for a conservation is going to depend on the threats that that organism has and on that organism in particular. So looking first of all at in situ conservation, that's when they try and look after those organisms in their natural environment. So that is the preferred method. Setting up things like national parks, national nature reserves, and they can establish these in situ sites as well in private land or farm sites. And there's certain things that they want to try and do. They want to try and raise the carrying capacity of that population, so raise the maximum population that that organism could have. They want to encourage the dispersion of individuals, so create things like wildlife corridors for those organisms to be able to move if you've got habitat fragmentation taking place, for instance. They want to control predators that that organism might have. They might want to vaccinate against disease, so things like koalas. Koalas at the moment are in trouble because of disease, mostly things like chlamydia, so particular diseases. So they're looking to vaccinate those populations to try and help the koala populations. But quite often, actually, you have multiple threats. So it's not just one thing, it's multiple things. So with something like the koala, yes, they've got diseases and that is an issue, but also they've got habitat loss as well. And things like the big fires that they had going through Australia, those were a big threat to the koala populations. So sometimes they need to have lots of different conservation strategies in place in order to try and save that particular species, to try and raise the numbers of those particular species. They might need to do things like preventing pollution, so find out the source of those pollution. So I like to see it a little bit like CSI, where they're trying to establish what exactly is happening with that organism and what can they do to try and help the numbers increase for that particular organism. And there are some weird and wonderful conservation strategies like toad sausages, would you believe? So this is the quoll, which I mentioned in the last lesson. He's super cute. And they've been eating the poisonous cane toad. And unfortunately, the quoll numbers have seriously dropped. So conservationists are trying to educate them by feeding them these toad sausages. So they taste like toad, but actually they've got a chemical in them that will make the quolls feel sick, so that the quolls will stop eating the toads. But they won't actually die of the toad sausages, but it will stop them from eating those cane toads. Killer robots. So this is the crown of thorns starfish, otherwise known as cots. And they decimate coral reef populations. So lots of coral species that are in danger because of the crown of thorns starfish. And the reason why we've got very, very large numbers of the crown of thorns starfish is because of eutrophication. So agricultural runoff increasing the amount of nitrates that you've got in the water, and then this crown of thorns population booms. So you get really, really high population of the crown of thorns starfish, and they will eat large areas of coral. So Queensland University have invented these COTSbots, which are starfish killing robots. So they'll detect the crown of thorns starfish and they'll search for it, and then they'll destroy the crown of thorns starfish. So they need to think about what the threats are to particular populations and what they can actually do about it. And so some more local examples then are reintroduction of otters. So our otter populations decrease massively, and otters are keystone species. So they are ecological ecosystem engineers, and actually by reintroducing otters, we can do things like reduce flooding in an area. So really, really important. But also by preserving these reed beds, the bittern numbers are increasing as well. So it works for both of those species, otter populations increasing, but also bittern numbers. Bittern numbers declined to just 20 in 1994, and now those natural habitats are being protected. The numbers of those bittern populations have massively increased. So there are a number of advantages of in situ conservation. First of all, it's looking after plants and animals in their natural environment, which is always best to look after them in their own habitat. Permanently protects biodiversity and the ecosystem of that whole area. So not just one species, lots of different species that are going to be protected. It also protects the natural and cultural heritage of that particular area. They can manage that area properly. They can look for opportunities for sustainable land use. They can do scientific research on that particular area. And they can restore areas if they need to. But there are a few disadvantages. So some species are threatened because of habitat fragmentation. So if you don't have a big enough area, then it might not be comprehensive enough. And that means that actually those populations are going to continue to decline. They might have already lost a lot of its genetic diversity. So for evolution to take place, you need to have variation. There needs to be lots of different alleles in the gene pool. And if your population has diminished, if it's declined to a really, really small number, then you might not have all of those different alleles in the gene pool to be able to overcome new selection pressures that they might have. The conditions might still be present. So the reason why that organism is threatened, maybe it's pollution, might still be there. And also, if you've got a national park, that might act as a honeypot. So it might attract poachers to a particular area, or ecotourists to a particular area. And those ecotourists could potentially cause damage. So if they're going to set up a national park, they need to make sure it's comprehensive, that they've got as many species as they can in a particular area. And they need to make sure that the area that they put aside for this park is adequate. It's big enough to provide long-term survival of the species and those populations and communities. And it needs to be representative. So they need to make sure that they've got a full range of diversity in those particular areas. So we've got various government bodies that are responsible for setting up and maintaining conservation reserves. You might recognise some of these. We've got Natural England, Countryside Council for Wales, Environment and Heritage Services, Scottish National Heritage. So all of those. And we've got quite a few national parks here in the UK. So we've got 14 national parks. You might recognise the name of some of these. Got Peak District, got Lake District, Cairngorms, Dartmoor National Park. Got 215 national nature reserves in the UK. And we've got over 6,000 SSSIs, so special sites of scientific interest. And we've got these local nature reserves. So lots of these local nature reserves that are run by the Country Wildlife Trust. So this is just an infographic about the National Parks Conservation Association, which has been going for, was 100 years in 2018. Got the number, so 1.3 members, 3 million, members, 65,953 acres, 350 partner groups. Partner groups is really important actually. You often have governments and lots of different organisations and Indigenous populations working together to try and establish these national parks. So it's really important that they've got that communication between them. And there are a few success stories. So this is these pictures from the Finda Game Reserve in South Africa. And since the year 2000, they've reintroduced 100 wildebeest, 30 white rhinos, 56 elephants, 17 cheetahs, as well as zebra and giraffe populations. And it's now become a popular tourist destination for safari. And conservation doesn't necessarily mean that humans can't use that particular area, because we need to respect the indigenous populations of that area. And sometimes that can lead to conflict, which we'll look at a little bit later. Conflict because you've got animals raiding crops. The people might still need to hunt for food and for clothing, other resources. They still need to be able to harvest plants for medicine or food or fuel. And tourists, when the tourists come into the area, potentially those could pollute the area, and that can cause conflict as well. Now, one thing that's been going on in Britain, which is really important, so this is fairly recent, they've set up this rewilding project where they've identified a number of keystone species that have been lost from a particular area. So a bit like the otter that we were looking at before. They're trying to reintroduce those species, and they are looking very carefully at the wildlife that's there, the ecosystems that are there, and all they're trying to do is trying to get those ecosystems to function at their optimum. So by reintroducing certain keystone species in those populations, they might be able to fix those ecosystems so that they function even better. Now, obviously, if they're going to reintroduce organisms to a particular area, then they need to speak to the local people in that area and make sure that they're happy for a particular species to be reintroduced. So, for instance, they wanted to reintroduce wolves up in Scotland, but obviously the local people were a little bit concerned about that because those wolf populations might actually leave the park area that they've been released in and go off into agricultural land and start to kill organisms in there. So, destroy cattle and things. So obviously they need to have an agreement with the local population if they're going to reintroduce a species to an area. So now we're going to have a little think about ex situ conservation. So ex situ conservation is really useful if, for whatever reason, those organisms can't be protected in their own habitat. So sometimes they'll need to be protected outside of its own environment. And one of the really important methods of ex situ conservation is zoos. Now, zoos have got a really good genetic resource, and they've got really good communication between them, so that they can do things like breeding programs to try and help to raise the population of particular species. So lots of these zoos started off as private collections and then became more to do with conservation, and education is a really, really important part of conservation. In fact, I would say that education is one of the most important parts of conservation. They've all got breeding programs, and they all make sure that they try and maximise the genetic diversity of those populations. They can monitor the health of those organisms, and they can protect them as well from predators and things like that. So advantages then of ex situ conservation: they can protect from predation or poaching, they can monitor their health, they can divide populations if they need to for contingency reasons, they can measure the genetic diversity of a particular population, they can use breeding programs to increase the numbers, but also maximise the genetic diversity of those particular populations. They can do research, like look at behaviour of particular animals. They can raise funds to look after those populations. And as I said, education, really, really important part of conservation is education. The disadvantages are that within the small populations that they have in a particular zoo, they have got limited genetic diversity. They've got increased exposure to disease, so they can catch diseases from us and from other animals in the zoo, as well as us from them, or other animals from them. So exposure to disease. They are outside their natural habitat, which is not ideal. It's difficult to actually mimic the natural habitat, and it's difficult to manage their nutritional issues, so make sure that they have got a balanced diet. They might not behave the way that they would do in the wild, so they might have abnormal behaviour. They might not reproduce. It is expensive, and they may not be able to reintroduce populations back into the wild. So captive breeding programs are not always successful. Sometimes they fail to breed, sometimes there's not enough space, so you've got limited genetic diversity there, which means you've got less variation, and those organisms won't be able to, or won't have the alleles in their gene pool to be able to overcome new selection pressures. And difficulty reintroducing them to the wild. It might be that they don't know how to behave properly, they don't know how to evade predators. They might not be accepted by wild populations. So another thing that these zoos will do is preserving genetic material. So they might, for instance, freeze sperm and use that sperm then for artificial insemination through the process of in vitro fertilization. And then they can do embryo transfer methods, which we'll look at in the second year. And it's not just about animals, it's also about plants. So there are many plant species actually that are in danger of becoming extinct. So we've got things like Kew Gardens, like these botanical gardens then, that are trying to actually preserve plant populations. And that's really important, you know. First of all, there are lots of really beautiful plants in the world, but also they could be a really important medicine in the future. And we don't know the potential of these plants. So they've got these huge seed banks. Now, the good thing about plants is that they are quite easy to conserve because the seeds are these dormant stages and they can collect those seeds in large numbers and they can store them and they can prevent them from germinating until they actually want them to. So they can readily increase the population in those botanic gardens. Really, really good for research, and they can easily replant and reintroduce them into the wild. There are some disadvantages of conserving plants. So you can get disturbance when you collect those seeds, so you need to collect them in a very mindful way. It doesn't always represent the full genetic diversity of a population. Those plant species might not survive in different areas from their natural habitat. There could be storage issues. And if you've only got a limited stock, then if you're trying to do some kind of research, you can't really draw full conclusions from that evidence that you've managed to gather. But generally speaking, seed banks are a really good resource. They can dry and they can freeze seeds, and they can actually keep the moisture to a minimum and then regularly check the seeds to make sure that they're still viable by doing germination tests. So they'll take those seeds out, place them onto agar plates and just check to see whether those seeds will still germinate. So the overall advantages and disadvantages of ex situ conservation. Advantages then, you've got conservation of a species. It can help to increase the numbers and enables repopulation of a particular species. It enables research and education, which I said is really important. Disadvantages, it is expensive. Breeding programs don't always work. Reintroductions can fail. And they might actually encounter other problems with the established species in an area when they reintroduce them. Limited space means you've got reduced genetic diversity, so there's a lack of variation, and it means that those species can't adapt to changes. So we've got these two different types of conservation, but as I said, the conservation strategy that might be used for a species is very individual for that particular species. So they need to look at the threats that individual species has and think carefully about what is the best way of conserving that particular species. If you've got any questions, I'm available on Teams in our normal lesson slot.